I want you to take just a quick second and, well, look at the physical objects around you right now.
Yeah, just take a look around.
Like maybe it's the phone in your hand or the coffee cup on your desk or even the car parked outside your window. We live our entire lives inside this massive, largely invisible machine.
The global supply chain.
Exactly, the global supply chain. And because it's just always humming in the background, it feels, absolutely indestructible.
Right, it projects this aura of permanence, you know?
Yeah. We see thousands of these huge cargo ships crossing oceans every single day, and we hear about millions of data points synchronizing ports and trucks and automated warehouses. It feels like this engineering marvel that has just grown way too big and far too complex to ever fail.
It's a very comforting illusion, really. We look at the sheer scale of modern globalization, the interlocking networks of raw materials, manufacturing hubs, consumer markets, and we just naturally assume safety.
It's just so big.
Right. We assume that because it is so vital to daily life, it must be robust.
But what if history proves that this massive, intricate web can just disintegrate? And I'm not talking about a slow, manageable decline over a few decades. I'm talking about an absolute shattering in a matter of months with almost no warning.
Just overnight.
Literally, you wake up one day and the machine has just stopped.
And I think the most terrifying part isn't even the speed of the collapse.
No,
it's the realization that when the global economy shatters, it doesn't break randomly.
Yeah.
It breaks according to a very specific, deeply hidden architectural blueprint.
Wow.
Yeah, it fractures along the exact same fault lines every single time.
Which is exactly what we are going to explore today. We are doing a deep dive into that exact blueprint. We've been poring over a genuinely groundbreaking working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
And it is a massive piece of work.
It really is. It's titled The Anatomy of a Trade Collapse, the UK, 1929 to 1933. And our mission today is to completely rewire how you understand the fragility of the global economy.
Because we're going to walk through a forensic breakdown of this historical data. The researchers have unearthed some profound realities about the Great Depression, but more importantly, they've mapped out the universal mechanics of how world trade breaks down.
And it's not what you'd expect.
Not at all. I have to warn you, the way the system actually fails is deeply counterintuitive.
Right. So before we jump in, let's set some ground rules for how we're going to tackle this. We are absolutely not doing a dry academic reading of an economics paper.
Nobody wants that.
Nobody wants that. We're going to take this cold, hard data and translate it into the actual mechanics of human behavior and, global panic. We are going to systematically dismantle the assumptions most of us have about the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Depression, and how tariffs actually work in the real world.
Because if you just look at the surface-level historical narratives, you completely miss the underlying physics of the crash.
So let's start with the big picture. When we think about modern economic trauma, everyone immediately points to the 2008 Great Recession. That was the moment we all thought the modern hyperconnected supply chain was, uniquely vulnerable. But what if the 2008 trade collapse wasn't a modern anomaly at all?
That's the perfect place to start. Because when you lay the data from the 2008 Great Trade Collapse right next to the trade collapse of the 1929 Great Depression, a very unsettling picture emerges.
Like they line up.
They are not two distinct, historically isolated tragedies. They share the exact same underlying DNA.
It's almost like they're twins separated by a century.
The mechanics of world trade run on a deep cyclical logic. What this NBER research proves is that when the economic machinery breaks down, the gears snap in a highly predictable sequence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if those gears are made of 1920s steel or, 2000s silicon. The fundamental human and economic reactions are identical.
I keep picturing the global economy as this giant, heavy pendulum. We're constantly told we are moving forward, progressing into this shiny, frictionless, interconnected future.
But we aren't.
No. Underneath it all, the gravitational forces pulling on that pendulum haven't changed. And under the right conditions, it just violently swings right back to 1929.
But to actually prove that, to move beyond just a really compelling theory and establish it as an economic law, required an unbelievable amount of forensic labor.
Yeah, let's talk about the researchers for a second.
Right, so the researchers behind this paper, Alan de Bromhead, Alan Fernihough, Markus Lampe, and Kevin O'Rourke, they didn't just look at high-level GDP summaries.
No. They essentially performed extreme digital archaeology. I was reading about their methodology, and they literally went down into the dusty basements of economic history.
They really did.
They took the 1933 Annual Statement of the Trade of the United Kingdom, which is basically the master ledger of a dying empire.
Imagine the sheer scale of that document. The British Empire in 1933 was the central node of global commerce.
Everything flowed through them.
Exactly. And these scholars went line by line, analyzing the granular micro-level data of thousands of specific commodities. They were tracking the imports of 1,338 distinct varieties of goods starting from 1929.
That sounds exhausting.
Logging exactly what happened to every single item, from tons of raw cotton to, individual precision machine parts, year over agonizing year.
So they weren't just reading the summary, they were decoding the actual source code of a global collapse.
Yes.
And when you look at that raw, unfiltered data, the first thing that jumps out is a serious reality check about our recent history. I mean, we all remember 2008, the financial tsunami, the banks collapsing, the panic on the news. It felt like the end of the world.
The media certainly covered 2008 as the ultimate modern disaster.
Right.
Trade plummeted, supply chain seized up, credit markets froze.
But the cold data proves it was barely a drizzle compared to the Category 5 hurricane of 1929. And, well, to understand the sheer scale of the difference, we have to look at how the researchers measured the drop. They use a metric called log points. Let's pause and actually explain what a log point is, because if we don't, the numbers lose their impact.
It's an essential concept. When you are measuring massive, catastrophic changes in economics over multiple years, simple percentages can actually distort the reality because of what we call base effects.
Right.
So if something drops by 50% one year and then drops by 50% the next year, the raw numbers start getting muddy. Logarithmic points or log points measure proportional change symmetrically. They give us a much truer picture of the compounding velocity of a collapse.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's look at the numbers. In 2009, during the absolute bleeding edge of the Great Recession, United Kingdom imports fell by 0.076 log points.
A sharp, painful contraction, without a doubt. I mean, supply chains contracted, orders were canceled, but the system held.
Now look at the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1933, UK imports plummeted by an incomprehensible 0.54 log points, and their exports. They crashed by 0.65 log points.
When you graph these two eras side by side, the visual is just stunning. The 2008 line takes a noticeable ugly slump.
Yeah, a dip.
But the 1929 graph doesn't slump. It drives straight off a cliff, hits the ocean floor, and buries itself in the bedrock. The sheer scale of the value that simply evaporated into thin air makes 2008 look like a routine market correction.
It's the difference between hitting a bad pothole and losing the entire bridge. In 2008, you hit a pothole, it jars your teeth, maybe you blow a tire, you have to pull over and call a tow truck. It ruins your day, maybe your year.
Sure.
But in 1929, you are driving along, and the entire structural support of the bridge simply gives way and drops you into the river. The floor completely vanished.
That distinction between a temporary disruption and a structural vaporization is key.
Which naturally leads me to a question. If 1929 was the bridge collapsing, then 1929 must mathematically be the absolute worst single year for global trade in recorded history, right? Like, the initial drop must have been the biggest single shock to the system.
You would certainly assume that.
It totally did.
But this is where the historical data throws a massive curveball. The researchers analyzed over 150 years of data, stretching all the way back to 1870. And the single largest one-year drop in the value of imports didn't happen in 1929.
Wait.
It didn't happen in 1930 either. The single worst year in the history of British trade was 1921.
1921. I had to read that section of the paper 3 times. In 1921, imports dropped by 0.53 log points in a single year. Exports dropped by 0.61. It was an incredibly violent, instantaneous shock to the system. How did that even happen?
You have to look at the immediate aftermath of World War I. You had this massive artificial wartime production boom suddenly halting. Millions of soldiers were demobilizing and returning to shattered economies.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So there was a brief post-war restocking boom and then an absolute collapse of demand coupled with massive price instability. The bottom fell out of the market all at once.
But wait, if 1921 had a steeper one-year drop, why does 1929 live in infamy? Why do we talk about the Great Depression and not the Great Crash in 1921?
Because of the shape of the recovery. 1921 was a brutal, deep stab wound. It was devastating, but the bleeding stopped, and the economy began to heal relatively quickly.
Okay, so it bounced back.
The terror of 1929 wasn't the sheer depth of the initial shock. The true horror was the psychological suffocation. It was an unyielding 4-year downward spiral.
Every time they thought they had finally hit the bottom, the floor gave way again.
Exactly. You survive 1929, you think, well, that's the worst of it. But then 1930 goes down further. You scrape by, but 1931 goes down again. By 1932, the compounding nature of the collapse destroys not just capital, but all human optimism.
Wow.
Yeah, 1921 was a sharp shock. 1929 was a 4-year strangulation.
Okay, so we have this 4-year strangulation where the nominal value of trade is just evaporating. Billions of pounds are being wiped off the ledgers. Between 1929 and 1931, a third of the UK's entire trade value disappears.
A full third.
So common sense dictates that the physical ports must have been ghost towns, right? I'm picturing empty docks, rusting cranes, silent harbors.
That is the most logical assumption you could make. If the value of trade drops by a third, the physical volume of trade must have dropped by a similar amount.
Right.
But the microdata reveals one of the most bizarre anomalies of the Great Depression. The physical cargo ships never stopped coming.
This blew my mind. There is a massive divergence between nominal value, the actual money exchanging hands, and physical volume, which is the sheer tonnage of stuff on the boats.
In 1930 and 1931, the nominal value crashed violently. But the physical volume of the goods being unloaded at British ports remained incredibly stable. And here is the truly incredible part.
I love this part.
In 1931, the physical volume of imports actually increased slightly. It ticked up by 0.036 log points.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. The money is evaporating into thin air, but the actual physical stuff isn't. The world is still digging up the same amount of coal. They're still harvesting the same tonnage of wheat, loading it onto the same ships, and sending it across the same oceans.
Yes, the physical machinery of global commerce kept churning out product, but the financial compensation for that product plummeted.
I was trying to visualize what that actually looks like on the ground. Imagine walking into your local mega grocery store during this period. You look down the aisles and the shelves are completely packed.
Fully stocked.
Right. There is the exact same amount of fresh produce, the same amount of canned goods. You look out the back door and the same number of delivery trucks are backing up to the loading dock. To your eyes, nothing has changed. The physical reality of the store is 100% intact.
Right.
But you walk into the manager's office, you look at the cash register receipts, and they are bringing in 30% less money for moving the exact same amount of food.
It's a brilliant analogy because it highlights the disconnect between the physical economy and the monetary economy. The flow of goods remained constant, but the value assigned to those goods fell off a cliff.
But why? Why wouldn't a supplier in Argentina or India just stop putting wheat on the boat if they weren't getting paid what it was worth?
Because in many cases, they couldn't afford to stop. If you were an agricultural producer, your crop is already planted, your debts are fixed. You still owe the bank a specific amount of money.
Oh, man. So you have to sell more just to make the same payment?
Exactly. If the price of your wheat drops by half, you can't just sell half your wheat. You actually have to try and grow and sell more wheat just to make the same debt payment. It creates a perverse cycle where producers flood the market with physical volume, desperately trying to chase vanishing revenue.
Which forces us to ask the ultimate question, what actually killed the value of trade? If it wasn't the boat stopping, what murdered the numbers on the ledger? If you open a standard high school history textbook, it will give you a very simple answer.
Oh, man.
It will tell you that the 1929 trade collapse was caused by panicked governments throwing up massive walls of protectionism and tariffs.
And this NBER paper provides the definitive data to prove that, at least for the initial phase of the crash, those textbooks are fundamentally wrong.
They did a deep data decomposition, breaking down exactly what caused the drop in the value of UK imports between 1929 and 1933. And they found that a staggering 83% of the drop was driven purely by price collapses. Deflation, not tariffs, not physical volume shrinking, just brutal, unyielding deflation.
We have to remember the timeline of British economic policy. Until late 1931, the United Kingdom was still the global champion of free trade. They had not put the tariff walls up yet.
So they literally couldn't be the cause.
Mathematically, tariffs literally could not have caused the initial crash from 1929 to 1931. Deflation was the grim reaper that slaughtered the value of world trade.
Deflation is one of those concepts that sounds clinical until you actually think about what it does to a human being trying to run a business. Money becomes too valuable and goods become worthless.
Yes.
If you bought raw materials for $100 in January, and by the time you manufactured the product in June, the market price for the finished good was only $80, you are bankrupt through no fault of your own. the market murdered itself.
It completely reframes how we view systemic risk. We are so conditioned to look at politicians and policy decisions as the root cause of an economic crisis. But sometimes the crisis is purely a mathematical function of a deflationary spiral.
Right.
When demand shocks and credit contractions occur, prices implode across the board, completely independent of whatever the government is doing with trade policy.
Okay, so prices implode, the money vanishes, and thousands of import-export companies are going bankrupt. Supply chains are hemorrhaging cash. Given that absolute carnage, you would naturally assume that entire categories of products simply went extinct.
You would hypothesize that a massive culling took place, that specialized items, niche foreign imports, or luxury goods simply vanished from the global supply chain as the pipelines dried up.
But the microdata shows almost nothing disappeared. In 1929, before the crash, the UK imported 1,338 distinct varieties of goods. By 1933, at the absolute miserable rock bottom of the Great Depression, they were still importing 1,298 varieties.
Oh, that is only a 3% drop in the actual variety of goods crossing the borders.
It's basically a rounding error. How is that possible?
In trade economics, we use two terms to describe how trade shrinks or grows: the extensive margin and the intensive margin.
Okay, let's break those down.
The extensive margin refers to the actual number of different types of things you buy or the number of different countries you buy from. If you stop buying foreign cars altogether, that's a change in the extensive margin.
You completely sever the line. And the intensive margin?
The intensive margin is the volume of the things you already buy. If you usually buy 10 foreign cars a year, and this year you only buy 2, the intensive margin has shrunk. But the extensive margin is intact because you are still participating in the car trade.
So to translate that into what actually happened during the Depression, the collapse wasn't a mass extinction event for products. The extensive margin didn't die. It was a brutal, systemic shrinkage of order sizes. It was entirely driven by the intensive margin.
People still demanded the exact same array of products. The catalog of human desire or industrial necessity didn't fundamentally change. They just bought vastly less of everything.
The analogy I keep coming back to is a massive plumbing system. The pipes connecting all the countries of the world didn't rust away or get ripped out of the walls. The infrastructure remained perfectly intact, but the pressure of the water flowing through those pipes dropped to a mere trickle.
And there's a very rational business reason for this. Setting up a new international supply chain, finding a reliable supplier, negotiating terms, organizing shipping logistics, establishing credit is incredibly expensive and difficult.
It takes years.
Exactly. Once those pathways are established, businesses will do everything in their power to keep them open, even if they are only shipping a fraction of their previous volume. They endure the losses to keep the pipeline alive, hoping for a recovery. Shutting it down completely means having to rebuild from scratch later.
That makes perfect sense. So if the pipes are still open, but the volume is shrinking, what exactly are people cutting back on? This brings us to a fascinating look at human psychology. When global income drops and panic sets in, what do we actually give up first?
If you ask someone on the street, they might hypothesize that in a severe depression, people would immediately stop buying imported luxury foods or daily comforts and retrench to absolute austere basics.
Right, you'd think people would stop buying French wine or imported coffee and start living on local potatoes. But the data shows the exact opposite.
Completely the opposite.
From 1929 to 1931, the imports of durable goods, things like automobiles, heavy machinery, industrial metals, they fell off an absolute cliff. They were decimated. But food and non-durable consumer goods, they barely flinched.
It reveals something very profound about how human beings process risk and uncertainty during a crisis. When the world feels like it's ending, we instinctively delay long-term commitments. We stop upgrading our capital equipment.
Makes sense.
A factory owner cancels the order for new weaving machines. A family decides their old car can run for another 5 years.
We freeze all long-term investments. But we absolutely refuse to stop eating our favorite foods or buying our small daily comforts. It's like, the economy's collapsing, I might lose my job, I'm definitely not buying a new truck, but I am absolutely not giving up my favorite brand of imported tea.
Precisely. Hard assets and durable goods become the biggest losers because their purchase can almost always be delayed. You can't delay eating dinner. Entire global industrial supply chains died simply because of this automatic human reflex to preserve daily routine and short-term consumption while immediately sacrificing long-term capital investment.
And what's truly eerie is how timeless this human reflex is, which sets up an incredible comparison between 1929 and 2008.
The researchers ran a correlation analysis between the specific UK industries that crashed from 1929 to 1931 and the specific US industries that crashed during the Great Recession from 2008 to 2009.
Think about how alien those two worlds are from each other. 1929 is the era of steam power, steel mills, telegraphs, and coal-fired ships. 2008 is the era of the internet, silicon chips, smartphones, and globalized, just-in-time automated logistics. You couldn't pick two more technologically distinct economies.
Yet the data shows a massive, undeniable, positive correlation between the industries that suffered in both eras.
It's spooky. The graph in the paper is basically a straight line pointing up. If your specific type of industry died in 1929, your modern equivalent industry also died in 2008.
It proves that the logic of a collapse is baked into our nature. Automobiles, heavy machinery, and industrial raw materials were the ultimate victims in both centuries.
Wow.
The technological dressing changes, maybe it's a steam tractor in 1929 and a computerized forklift in 2008, but the core economic behavior of delaying durable purchases remains an absolute fundamental law of nature.
Up until this point in the timeline, late 1931, the United Kingdom is essentially just taking the hits. They are maintaining their century-old philosophy of free trade, standing in the storm, and watching the world burn around them. But then, the psychological pressure breaks them.
This is the pivotal moment in the historical narrative. How does an empire that practically invented, championed, and enforced the global free trade system for nearly a century suddenly commit ideological suicide over the course of a few weeks?
It was pure, unadulterated panic. In September 1931, the immense financial strain finally breaks the Bank of England, and the UK is forced off the gold standard. Their currency is in chaos. And in November 1931, the UK Parliament scrambles and passes the Abnormal Importations Act.
The name of the legislation itself tells you everything you need to know about their sudden shift in worldview. They no longer viewed incoming foreign goods as trade, they viewed them as an abnormality that was threatening the nation and needed to be forcefully stopped.
This act gave the government the power to instantly impose tariffs of up to 100% on manufactured goods coming from outside the British Empire.
A 100% tariff is not a tax meant to raise revenue. It is a brick wall meant to completely prohibit a transaction.
Free trade died almost overnight. The era of the open global ocean was over, and the era of walled economic fortresses had begun. The British political establishment threw away 100 years of economic doctrine in a blind panic.
And they didn't just build a uniform wall around their island. They built a highly complex, deeply discriminatory wall.
They didn't just protect themselves. They used the crisis to draw a deeply unequal, highly aggressive red line across the entire global economy. This culminates in the Ottawa Conference of July 1932. This is where they established the infamous imperial preference system.
If we look at how this reshaped the world map, it's startling. They didn't just walk away from globalism. They created a rigid, tiered hierarchy, a pyramid of global trade. At the absolute top, dictating the terms, was the UK itself.
Right.
In the middle tier were the empire countries, the dominions like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and colonies like India. They were given VIP access, free passes, or very low taxes to sell their goods in the UK market.
And at the absolute bottom of the pyramid, everyone else, the United States, Germany, Argentina, Japan, the so-called foreigners, they got slammed with massive tariffs. The global map was violently shattered into walled factions. The UK essentially looked at the rest of the world and said, we are taking our toys, we are taking our colonies, and we are going home.
To understand the sheer brutality of this discrimination, we have to look at the exact numbers. The UK's tariffs weren't just a gentle nudge to buy British. They were a perfectly engineered weapon designed to squeeze specific nations dry while handing out lucrative monopolies to their imperial partners.
The data is staggering. After 1932, foreign industrial goods faced weighted average tariffs spiking well over 20%. They were intentionally priced completely out of the market. Meanwhile, if you were inside the empire, your agricultural goods faced an absolute 0% tariff. Your industrial goods faced tariffs under 5%.
It was a massive, deliberate market distortion.
I keep picturing a bouncer at an exclusive nightclub. A stranger walks up, say, a manufacturer from the US or Germany, and the bouncer demands a $200 cover charge. Just step foot inside the door. Obviously, the stranger turns around and walks away.
Obviously.
But then all of the bouncer's cousins show up Canada, Australia, and he waves them right through the velvet rope for free and tells the bartender to give them discounted drinks. It is completely rigged game.
And a rigged game has devastating consequences for the losers. In 2008, when global trade shrank, it shrank everywhere. Everyone took a haircut. It punished the whole world relatively equally because the underlying system of globalized trade mostly stayed intact.
Yeah.
But after the UK changed the rules in 1931, the crash mutated into a targeted geographic assassination.
The researchers' data highlights this shift perfectly. During the free trade period, from 1929 to 1931, UK imports from the empire and imports from the rest of the world fell evenly. Everyone was suffering together in the deflationary spiral. But look at what happens from 1931 to 1933 after the walls went up.
Imports from the foreigners plummeted by another 30%.
Wait, 30%? Oh, wow.
30%. That is an absolute collapse of established trade routes. But imports from the empire, they miraculously stopped falling. In fact, they actually rose by 1.02%.
Policy violently warped the natural geography of trade. The British government completely cut off specific nations from the global economic bloodstream to artificially pump blood into their own imperial system.
But while all this macro-level chaos is happening, while walls are going up, tariffs are spiking, and entire nations are being locked out of the market, there is one specific group of products that behaves in a completely irrational way.
This was my favorite part of the paper, because it makes zero sense until you really think about it. We are in an era where the entire world is doing a desperate fire sale. Prices for wheat, copper, and cotton are collapsing everywhere, but one elite class of products flat out refuse to drop their prices.
The data reveals that while generic raw materials and agricultural goods crashed 15% to 17% in price, complex, differentiated manufactured goods like high-end precision machinery, specialized vehicles, advanced electronics of the era, they only dropped 2% to 3%. They basically didn't budge.
Why? If the whole world is going broke, how can you possibly justify keeping your prices sky high?
It comes down to the economic power of differentiated goods. If you are a farmer selling generic wheat or a miner selling raw copper, you are a price taker. You are at the absolute mercy of the global commodity market.
Because it's all the same stuff.
Right. You take whatever price the market dictates because your wheat is chemically identical to the wheat of 1,000 other farmers. You have no leverage.
But if you sell a highly specific, custom-engineered precision engine, you are a price maker. You hold your price like a rock because your product has brand power, specialized patents, and highly skilled labor costs baked into it. You tell the desperate buyer, I don't care about the depression. This is what the engine costs to make. Take it or leave it.
But here is where the economic reality asserts itself. You might have the power to hold your price steady, but does that make you a brilliant businessman? If you refuse to lower your prices during the worst deflationary economic depression in human history, you must be a genius, right?
Wrong. It turns out refusing to discount wasn't a stroke of genius. It was an economic suicide pact.
Because these high-tech durable goods refused to drop their prices, the market punished them through the only other avenue available. If price won't give, volume must.
Their total trade value plummeted entirely because buyers simply stopped buying them altogether. It's the ultimate corporate stubbornness. The manufacturers sat in their boardrooms, folded their arms, and said, we have a premium product. We will not dilute our brand by discounting our machines.
And the market looked at them and said, fine. We will let you keep your pristine, high price tag as you go entirely bankrupt from having zero sales.
It is a textbook example of how price rigidity in a deflationary environment destroys your industry. The market will clear one way or another. If it cannot clear through price adjustments, it will clear through volume dropping to zero.
It's a fascinating trap. So let's pull the lens back. We've seen how government policy and corporate pricing strategies interact. And when governments step in with a heavy hand, they fundamentally break the economic matrix.
Remember that spooky correlation we talked about earlier? How the 1929 crash in the UK looked exactly like the 2008 crash in the US? Well, the researchers found that during the UK's free trade period from 1929 to 1931, UK trade correlated perfectly with the modern 2008 crash. The natural laws of economics were functioning normally.
But then we look at the protectionist period from 1931 to 1933, the era of the tariff walls. And suddenly, that correlation doesn't just weaken, it flips entirely to negative.
Protectionism literally reversed the laws of economic gravity. The government's heavy hand completely distorted natural supply and demand. The market was no longer deciding what was valuable. Politicians in London were deciding what was valuable. The natural order of the global economy was broken.
Which forces us to evaluate the ultimate test of the UK's grand strategy. They threw away a century of free trade, they alienated their global partners, and they walled off the empire. Did their geopolitical masterstroke actually work? Did it save the British economy?
Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read the history books, it completely backfired on the UK itself.
It is a stunning historical irony. Between 1931 and 1933, as we discussed, UK imports from the empire did recover slightly. They went up 1%. So the UK successfully provided a safe haven for Canadian wheat and Australian wool. They essentially subsidized their imperial farmers.
But the empire didn't return the favor. The whole point of the system was supposed to be a mutually beneficial loop. You'd think the colonies, now flush with British cash, would turn around and buy more British manufactured goods to save the factories in Manchester and Birmingham. But they didn't. UK exports to the empire continued to shrink. They dropped by a further 3.72%.
Why did it fail? Because those empire nations were largely agricultural, and agricultural prices had still collapsed globally. Even with preferential treatment, they simply didn't have the wealth to buy expensive British machinery. The UK essentially gave a massive free gift to the empire's agricultural producers, but the policy entirely failed to save the UK's own export economy. The walled garden only grew in one direction.
But wait, while the British export economy was supposedly burning to the ground, they were quietly executing a very dark maneuver behind the scenes. On paper, their factories are closing. But underneath the surface, the bizarre mechanics of deflation were allowing the UK to pull off one of the greatest global wealth extractions in history.
This is perhaps the most insidious part of the data. It comes down to a concept called the terms of trade. Your terms of trade are essentially the ratio between the prices of the things you export and the prices of the things you import.
Let's break down how the UK weaponized this. The UK was an industrial island. They mostly imported raw materials and food. And as we know, the prices of those generic goods crashed globally by 15% to 17%.
Right. But the UK exported manufactured goods, those complex, differentiated goods we talked about earlier, and the prices of those goods remained incredibly stubborn, only dropping 2% to 3%.
Because of this imbalance, the UK's terms of trade skyrocketed. To put it in tangible terms, imagine a farmer in Argentina trading his wheat for a British tractor. In 1929, maybe it takes 10 tons of wheat to buy one tractor. But by 1932, the price of the British tractor hasn't changed, but the global price of wheat has been cut in half.
Right.
Now, that same Argentine farmer has to ship 20 tons of wheat across the ocean just to buy the exact same tractor.
Deflation became a tool of exploitation. Without passing a single law to do so, the industrial core was effectively sucking double the physical wealth out of the agricultural periphery, simply because the periphery couldn't control the prices of their own raw materials.
It's terrifying when you realize that a crashing global market can actually be weaponized by the countries holding the high-tech, rigid price goods.
If we compress all of this, the decades of data, the millions of ledger entries, the deeply human psychological reactions we are left with, what the researchers essentially prove are two unbreakable iron laws of global economic collapse. Ignore them at your own peril.
Law number 1, the intensive margin dictates everything. A global trade collapse does not happen because the avenues of trade disappear. It doesn't happen because countries forget how to trade or because product categories go extinct. It happens because the existing pipes choke. The volume of existing trade shrinks brutally while the infrastructure remains intact.
And law number 2, durability is destiny. In any global crisis, whether it is driven by a gold standard collapse in 1929 or a subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, durable goods, the heavy machinery, the automobiles, the industrial capital will always be the hardest hit victims. Human psychology guarantees that long-term investment will be instantly sacrificed to preserve short-term consumption.
These two laws are the deep, unchangeable operating system of the global economy.
Which leaves us with one final urgent consideration. We've spent this whole time dissecting history, but history is only useful if it helps us see the present clearly.
History doesn't repeat, but it always rhymes. If we look out the window today, are we standing on the exact same precipice?
We have to look objectively at the geopolitical and macroeconomic environment right now. We are currently seeing rising geopolitical conflicts. We are seeing severe inflation volatility and shifting monetary policies.
Yep.
We are seeing the return of tariff walls and industrial subsidies. And perhaps most importantly, we are seeing a massive push by governments toward de-risking, friendshoring, and forming localized economic blocs.
It is impossible to ignore the structural parallels. And just to be clear, We are strictly looking at the economic mechanics here, not taking political sides on whether these policies are justified. But the shift in the data is undeniable. Are we sliding away from a 2008-style free trade collapse where the whole world suffers a temporary shock together but eventually recovers together, and moving into a 1931-style fragmented walled garden collapse?
Are we basically rebuilding the imperial preference system, just under new names? We call it strategic decoupling or securing supply chains today, but the underlying mechanism shutting the door on the foreigners and granting VIP access to a select group of allies looks incredibly familiar to anyone who has studied the UK's pivot in 1931.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? If the global economy splits into distinct, heavily guarded geopolitical islands, just like the UK and its empire in 1932, who will become the newly isolated foreigners of the 21st century. And more importantly, thinking about those stubborn differentiated goods, what happens to our modern tech sectors when the prices of today's high-tech durable goods like advanced semiconductors, AI servers, and electric vehicles finally break under the pressure of a fragmented world?
It is a profound, incredibly complex question, and the historical data suggests the transition to that fragmented world will not be gentle.
When we started this deep dive, we talked about how indestructible the modern supply chain looks. Millions of packages moving seamlessly, just-in-time manufacturing humming along. But history shows us that the invisible gears turning that machine are incredibly fragile. A sudden shift in prices, a political panic in a major capital, and suddenly the bridge collapses beneath you. I want to highly recommend diving into the source material if you want to see the math for yourself. The phenomenal work of de Bromhead, Fernihough, Lampe, and O'Rourke is a masterclass in economic history. Keep your eyes on the pendulum, because the forces pulling it down never ever sleep.